So in this video we're going to complete the project by building an environment for the fish to be swimming in. So let's go to a new mesh item. I'm just going to look down on the scene. I'm going to start by building the seabed. So I'm going to run the cube tool, just drag out a polygon looking down on the scene, and I want to make sure it's centered. So I'm going to zero out the positional channels in tool properties, and I want the size of it to be 25 meters by 25 meters. And then we need to dice it up, so let's have 20 segments on X and 20 segments on Z. So we don't want the seabed to be completely flat, so I'm going to bring up the sculpting palette, just run the push tool, right click from the brush size, and I just want to sculpt the seabed so it's got a bit more variation to it. Kind of bring the edges up so you're leaving a bowl in the middle. There's a good reason for that, which you'll discover soon. Okay, so you've done that, hit tab. So next I want to place rocks and boulders on the seabed, but I want to do it in a very naturalistic way. And to do that I'm going to use recoil. First of all, we actually need some rocks. So if you open up your preset browser, and in assets go to meshes, organic, and in there are two rocks, so just double click on both of them. So now we need to duplicate these rocks, so select rock 1, let's go to duplicate, and I'm going to run replica array, click in the viewport, and I want the count to be 5 on the X, Y and Z, and we just need to space them out so they're not too close to each other. Drop a tool, then select the other rock, and in item mode we'll move that one up, then run replica array again, click in the viewport, and this time I'm going to only have 1 on Y, but I'm going to have 10 on X and Z. Now the reason I use replicators is it's very easy to add random twist and scale. So let's select one of the replicators, and in properties we can put a random scale of 30%. Just make sure they're not crossing. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And we can put a random rotation of 360 degrees. And then we can do the same with the other replicator. Now for these rocks to work in a simulation, they need to be separate items. So what we need to do is freeze the replicators. So select one of the replicators, go to Item, Replicator, and Freeze Replicator, and then do the same for the other one. Now I also want all of these rocks to be meshes, because ultimately I want to change the texture on some of them. So I'm going to expand the first replicator folder here. I'm going to shift select them all, right click, go to change type and select mesh, and all those instances will be converted to separate mesh items. So now I'm just going to select the rock 1, I'm going to drop that into that folder. And now I can do the same for the other one. So select all the instances, right click, change type to mesh, and drop the other rock into that folder. So next we need to position these rocks in the scene, so give them a starting point. So I'm going to select this folder first and move that roughly over the center of the seabed, and we'll just lift it up so it's sitting above it. And then for this one we'll do the same, but have these sitting above the first group. So let's go over to the Animate tab, and now we can run the simulation. So in item mode, start by selecting the seabed, let's go to recoil, and we'll make that a passive rigid body. And then we need to select all of the stones and make those active rigid bodies. So before we run the simulation, I just want to hide the rockfish. And at the moment the timeline is set to 500 frames, and that's far too much. We only need it to be 120 for the simulation. And then finally, we need to make sure that when the objects collide that they're using their polygons for the collision detection. So select the seabed, go to dynamic, and under collision shape change that to mesh. And then we need to do the same for all of the rocks. So when you've done that, hit run. So with that finished, we've now got the beginnings of a nice seabed environment. The problem is at the moment though, if we scrub the timeline, you see all the stones are animated. Now we don't want those moving during the animation. So what we need to do is freeze them at frame 120. Now we could bake it to a transform, but I just want all of this geometry in one layer. So what I'm going to do is go to select item types meshes, and that will select all of the mesh items in the scene. Now I'm going to hold down Control and deselect rockfish and deselect the 2 point clouds. Then I'm going to go to polygon mode, Control C to copy, and then we'll just go to a new mesh layer and Control V to paste. I'm going to rename that mesh seabed, and then we can delete everything else out. So delete the original seabed, delete the point clouds, the replicated items, and also recoil. So we'll make the rockfish visible, and we need to return the timeline back to 500 frames. Now select the seabed layer, and in polygon mode I'm just going to select the seabed mesh and hit W. I'm just going to move it up, so we're going to sink the rocks into the seabed slightly, make it look a bit more realistic. And now we need to decide where this seabed is going to be. Now we can't move the rockfish because it's being animated with an MDD, so we have to move the seabed relative to it. So in item mode, just going to a bit down here so I can see the rockfish, and we just need to place the environment so the fish is going to be swimming over an interesting area. Now I quite like this area at the front here because we've got a lot of rocks in the background and then a few scattered over, but there's areas of seabed that we can see. It's a bit more visually interesting. So let's place it around about there, but we can change that as we build the scene up. So the next thing to do is to animate the camera. So I change the viewport to a camera view, select the camera, and I'm going to key the position and rotation channels, and then using the navigation keys I'm just going to move the camera in the viewport till we get to a nice starting position. Now it's important at this point to set the aspect ratio of the camera. So if we go to the shader tree and to the render layer, under frame width and height we'll change this to 1280 by 720. So I've got the start position of the camera. Now I want to set the end position. So let's go to frame 500, and again we'll move the camera to a nice end position. So I think that's quite an interesting end position, but now with those 2 keyframes in place we can now decide what's going to happen in the middle. Now I'm going to leave it completely up to you. You can do whatever you like. I just want the fish to pass by the camera and then the camera to pass around the back of the fish. So I'm going to expand the dope track, go back to frame 0, and I'm going to select all the keys at frame 0 and copy them. I'll move about a third of the way along the animation, then right click and paste. and then just adjust the camera to the position that you want. Might want to get it a little bit closer, and then go another third of the way along the animation and position the camera again. Now, one of the problems of driving the animation with an MDD file is you won't get real-time feedback in the viewport, and when you're iterating a subtle camera move, it's very important that you see things in real time. So to do that, you're going to need to record an OpenGL movie. Now, before you do that, I would make the 3D viewport as small as possible. There's no point in having it at a huge resolution. It's only going to slow down the process. So make the viewport small, right-click and save OpenGL to movie. So I've done that here with my animation. So if I press play, you see the fish slowly passes by the camera, and then as the camera passes behind the fish, he quickly looks back, his fin folds down, then he looks forward and swims off into the distance. So with all the elements of my scene in place, I'm now ready to light and texture it. So I've come over to the render tab so we can see preview, and the first thing we want to do is texture the seabed. So I'm going to select that item, let's go to polygon mode, and I'll double click on the sand, hit M and call it sand, then hit the open bracket to invert the selection, call these rocks. Now we're going to texture these very simply with a couple of image maps. So we've got the shader tree, expand the render layer, and we'll start with sand. So go to add layer, image map, load image, and in your image directory you should find an image called Inc3. Open that up. So the first thing I'm going to do is adjust the gamma for 2.2. So under texture layers, I'm going to go 1 divided by 2.2. So by default that image map has picked up the UV map that was created when we made that piece of geometry. So let's go to texture locator and we'll change the projection type to planar, and we'll have the axis as Y. Now I think that texture is a little bit too small, so let's change the scale to 3 meters. So now we can add a different image map to the rocks. So let's go to the rocks material, add layer, image map, load image, and this time choose Inc13. Open that up. So as you can see, that image map has only been applied to some of the rocks, and that's because again it's picked up a UV map. So now under projection type, change the projection to cubic, and now all the rocks are covered. So again we need to go down to texture layers and adjust the gamma. Now I want to apply some bump to these surfaces, so I'm just going to select the color map, right click and instance it, then right click in the effect column and change the effect to bump, and under material set the bump amplitude to 100 millimeters, and then I want to do the same for the rocks. So we've got some nice textures in there, but it looks nothing like an underwater environment. Now there's two things that are going to make it look like it's underwater. First of all, there's the light direction, and secondly there's the environment color. So we'll start with the light. So in items we'll select the directional light, hit Y, and we want the light to be looking straight down on the scene. So now we can change the environment color. So go to the shader tree. At the bottom of the shader tree we have the environment material, and we'll change the environment type to constant. Now the color is very important, so I'm going to click on the color dialog to bring up the color picker, and I'm going to change the red to 0.03, the green to 0.17, and the blue to 0.32. Now you tend to get a lot of fog underwater, so in the shader tree let's go up to the base shader, and under fog change the fog type to underwater. and we can change the fog start distance to 1 meter and the fog density to 30%, and then make sure you check use environment color. So you can see it's beginning to look like an underwater environment, but I think it's a little dark. So in the item list I'll select the directional light, I'll change the intensity to 6, and you wouldn't find hard edge shadows underwater, so I'm going to change the spread angle to 10 degrees and increase the samples to 100. So I've moved the timeline along a little bit so the fish is closer to the camera, and you can see how the colours of the fish really stand out against that blue background. But now that we've got this fish into this environment, we can now fine-tune its textures. So let's go over to the shader tree and we'll expand RF body. Now the first thing that strikes me when looking at pictures of fish underwater is there shouldn't be any specularity on there. So I'm going to turn off the specular amount layer, and on the material I'm going to set the specular amount to 0. So the other thing that strikes me is there needs to be more subsurface scattering and the colours need to be more intense. So I go to the subsurface amount layer and I'll increase the high value to 70%. That'll give me more subsurface scattering, and then to intensify the colours I'm going to select the diffuse colour layer, right click and instance it, and then right click on the effect column and change the effect to subsurface color. So now the colors of the fish are glowing a lot more. Now the next thing I want to add is some depth of field, because that will really give some depth to the whole scene. Now to stop preview from updating all the time, I'm just going to put it on hold and I'm going to go back to frame 0. Now because the scene is animated, we're going to have to animate the focal point or the focal distance. So to do that, let's select the camera, go to camera effects, and we'll enable depth of field. And if you hit Y, you'll see a little blue box there, and we just need to move that till it's in the middle of the fish, and that is the focal point. So we want to animate that, so let's key it. And let's go to the next keyframe for the camera, and we'll move the focal point so it's back in the middle of the fish. Go to the next keyframe and do the same, and then finally at the end. Now because we've got depth of field in the scene, we're going to have to increase the anti-aliasing. So go to the shader tree and to the render layer, and under settings increase the anti-aliasing to 64, and because we've got movement in the scene as well, let's activate motion blur. So there's one final thing that I want to do to the rocks. Now these rocks in the background look really nice, mainly because they're blurred slightly with the depth of field, but some of the rocks actually come quite close to the fish and are quite in focus, and those ones look a little bit flat. So what I want to do, instead of using a bump map on these ones that are close to the camera, I want to actually displace them. So if I select the seabed layer, go to polygon mode, and I want to select these 6 rocks, and hit M, and I'm going to call them rock displace. And then I'm going to select these 2, right click and duplicate them, drag those into that material layer, and then change the effect to displacement, and on the material I want to change the displacement distance to 30 millimeters. And also I want to take specularity out of all of the rocks and also the sand. So you can see how much more believable those rocks are now. Okay, so I just want to do some final tweaks to the GI settings. So I'm going to go to the render layer, global illumination, start by zeroing out the ambient intensity because that's not really doing anything in this scene. And at the moment we're using irradiance caching for GI. Now because this is an animation, if I use irradiance caching I'm going to get some flickering, which I don't want. So I'm going to disable that, and when I do that I'm now just using brute force Monte Carlo. Now at the moment I have 64 samples on there, which will create quite a grainy image, so I'm going to increase the raise to 256. So we've got our basic underwater environment, but it's a little bit dead at the moment. So what we need to do just to finish it off is to add some effects. We're going to add some particles into the water, and we're going to add some caustics across the seabed. So let's start with the particles. So let's go over to the Setup tab, and in the item list we've got to add item. We'll go down to particles, and we'll load in a particle cloud. So by default you can see that that cloud is a sphere, but in this environment a better shape would be more of a cube. So in properties I'm going to change the shape to cube, and then if I hit R I can scale the cloud so it fills an area around the fish. Now hit W, let me just move it back over there. So that's, the fish is going to swim within this particle cloud shape. Let's hide the rockfish in the seabed so we can see the cloud more clearly. Now straight away I don't think there's enough particles in there, so in properties I'm going to up the max particles to 5000. Now at the moment these particles are static, but during the animation I want them to be slowly moving around in the water. So to do that we're going to have to add a particle step modifier. So let's go to add item, particles, particle step modifier. Under particle source we need to define the particle cloud. Now to see some animation we're going to have to apply something to the particles. So let's go to add item, volumes and sprite, and then we want the radius of the sprite to be about 7 millimeters, and we need to define the particle source as the step modifier. And if we zoom in you can now see we've got some little sprites in OpenGL. So to apply some subtle random motion to these points, let's go back to the particle step modifier. Let's go to channels. I want to select the P-pos X, Y and Z, which are the positional channels for the modifier, and we'll just drag those into the schematic. And then under add modifier, go to channel, and we'll add a channel noise modifier, and I just want to link up the noise modifier to all three channels. Now to see the animation more clearly we can hide the particle cloud, and if we press play you can see we're getting quite a aggressive movement of the points. So let's go to properties, and I'm going to drop the frequency of the noise modifier down to 1. That slows everything down. And then I'm going to reduce the speed to 0.2 and the amplitude to 0.2. So now we've got a very slow movement of the particles. It's got a little bit of randomization to it, but it just feels like those particles are floating in the current. So the final thing I want to do is add some caustics to the environment. So in the shader tree, let's go to add layer, textures, and we'll load in a cellular texture. Now because this is at the top of the shader tree, it'll be placed on top of every material in the scene. And I want to change the effect to a luminous amount. So right click in the effect column and change it to luminous amount. So now in preview the image is looking a little bit strange. We just need to adjust some of these texture settings. So let's go to texture locator, and we'll start by changing the scale of the texture. So we'll make it 600 millimeters, and then if we go to texture layers we can change the type to round, change the cell width to 50, transition width to 100, the bias to 95, and the gain to 30. So to add more interest to the caustics we can layer another cellular texture on top of it. So let's right click on that texture and duplicate it. Now for this one we'll change the scale, so this time we'll have it at 200 millimeters. We need to change the blending modes. We'll change the blending mode to screen, so we'll be able to see both textures now layered on top of each other. And we'll just adjust the cell width to 35. Now you can see that that texture is working really well on the rocks in the background, but it's not working so well over the fish. But because the fish is such a vibrant, luminous object anyway, I don't think there's any need to have the caustics on it. And it'll also help to frame the fish in the shot. So what I'm going to do is select all of the materials for the fish, and I'm going to drag and drop those above the cellular textures. And now we don't get any caustic effect on the fish. Now at the moment those cellular textures are static, but during the animation we need those caustics to be animated. Now because those cellular textures are three-dimensional textures, if we move them through the seabed surface they'll appear to animate. So select the first cellular texture, go to texture locator, and we're going to animate its Y position. So let's go to frame 0. We'll key position Y and we'll set it to minus 2.5 meters. Let's go to about frame 150, and we'll set it to 1.5 meters. And we want that movement to be linear. So right click, open up the graph editor, and we'll set a pre and post behavior of linear. So now we can do something similar to the other cellular texture. So select it, we'll key it at frame 150 and set it to 1 meter. And then we can go to frame 0, set that to minus 1.5 meters. And again we need it to be linear. So open up the graph editor and set the pre and post behavior. So that's the scene complete. So all we need to do now is render out the animation. So let's go to render animation. We want it to go from frame 0 to frame 500. We want it to be an image sequence. Okay, pick somewhere to save it. I'm going to save it as a TIFF sequence. I'll call it rockfish, and away we go. So when that's finished, you'll end up with your final animation. Now that's fine, but what if you looked at your final render and you thought, well, I think the strength of those caustics is a little bit too much, I want to change it. With the scene set up the way it is at the moment, you'd have to go back into the scene, make the change, and then re-render. A much better solution is to set up your scene so you can render it out in passes, and you can then comp those together and make any changes in post in an application like Nuke. So to do that, we first need to adjust the shader tree so it's capable of producing all of the passes that we want. So we'll start by isolating the two main elements of the scene. So in the shader tree we'll go to add layer and we'll create a group and we'll call that rockfish, and then we'll select all of the rockfish materials, drag and drop those into that group, and then if you select the group down in properties we need to make sure it's looking at the rockfish item. So under item, select the rockfish mesh layer. And then we can do the same for the seabed. So add another group. And we'll call that seabed. And select all of those materials, drag and drop those into the layer. And then do the same with the two cellular textures. And select the seabed group, and then select the seabed item. So what I want to be able to do is render out the fish separately to the environment. So to do that, we'll select the base shader, we'll drag that into the seabed layer, and then right click and duplicate it, and drag the other base shader into the rockfish layer. So we now have independent visibility for each of those items. So if I select the base shader in the seabed, I can turn off visible to camera and that will be hidden. If I select the rockfish base shader and turn that off, the fish disappears. So now we need to think about how we're going to output those two images. Well, at the top of the shader tree we have a final color output, and we can set a destination path for that render. But these two images are going to be rendered at the same time and need to be saved in two different places, so we're going to need two final color output layers. So right click on that and duplicate it, and we'll call that one rockfish color, and we'll call this one seabed color. Now, as far as the alpha output is concerned, we're going to need that for the fish. So I'm going to rename that one Rockfish Alpha. So we can isolate those two elements of the scene, but what about the scene in general? Well, first of all, the particles that we created in 3D look really good, but they do slow down render time, and you could probably recreate an effect like that in post using a particle system. So in items, I'm just going to turn them off and not render them at all. So what about depth of field? Well, depth of field is something else that we could adjust in post. So what I'm going to do is go to the render layer, settings, and I'm going to turn off depth of field, and then we need to add a depth output. So I've got to add layer, render output, and under effect I'm going to right click and select depth. And now in preview I can select that layer, and you can see the output there. So what about motion blur? Because that's something else that slows down render time. Well, let's turn off motion blur. We'll add another render output, right click on the effect column, and this time we'll select motion vector, because that's something else that can be applied in post. So what else might you want to adjust? Well, you might want to affect the shadows in some way during the animation. You might want to make them darker, lighter, maybe change the color slightly. So in the shader tree we'll add another render output, right click in the effect column and change that to shadow density, and we can see that in preview. And finally, you might want to control the caustics across the whole scene. So again, in the shader tree we'll go add layer, render output, right click in the effect column, and we'll change this to luminous shading. So I'm going to stop there, but you could carry on breaking the scene down into finer and finer elements, so you've got more and more control over that final image. So what we need to do next is set an output destination and file name for each of these outputs. So I've done all of them apart from the seabed color here. So just select the output, hit browse. Now what I've done is I've created a folder for each output. So select the right one, seabed color, select the file type and give it a name and hit save. So now we can define the passes. We need to start by defining a pass group. So at the top of the interface under pass groups, click new, and we'll call this rockfish. Click OK. So we need to start with our first group, which is seabed color. So under passes, click new, and we'll call this seabed color. Click OK. And now we need to make the changes to the scene. So we want to hide all the other outputs. In preview we can select seabed color so we can see exactly what's going to be rendered in this pass. We don't want to see the fish, so come down to the base shader for the rockfish and decheck visible to camera, and we don't want to see the caustics or the cellular textures, so we'll hide those too. So now for the next pass, so we'll click new. This one will be rockfish color. When we click OK, everything that we hid is now visible, so we're back to the starting point again. So this time we want to select the base shader for the seabed and decheck visible to camera. Again, we can select a rockfish color here, and then we also want to hide all the other outputs. So for the separate alpha channel for the fish, again click new, we'll call this rockfish alpha, click OK. Let's see the alpha channel in preview. We'll hide all the other outputs, and again select the base shader for the seabed and decheck visible to camera. Now the depth output and the motion vector output are pretty simple because we need to see the whole scene for those. So we'll click New, we'll call this Depth. We have to take a look at that depth output, and all we need to do is hide all the other outputs. So click New again, and this time we'll call this Motion. And then we just need to select the motion vector output and hide all the others. Now the shadow density is just for the shadows in the background. So we'll click New, call it Shadow. Let's take a look at that shadow density output. So we don't want to see the fish, so we'll hide all the other outputs and also hide the rockfish. And finally, for the luminous output, click New, call it Luminous. Again, let's see that in preview, and we'll hide all the other outputs and again hide the rockfish. So now we can render it, so we'll just go back to none for the passes, so we're back to the starting point. So I'm not going to render out the whole animation, I'm just going to render out a single frame, so I'm going to go to about frame 220 and we'll go Render and Render Passes, and we need to select the pass group and click OK. So when I was finished, I saved it out as a layered PSD. I've done a very simple comp here in Photoshop. So I've got the rockfish on a layer of its own, and I've got the caustics on another layer, or the luminous shading output, and then the environment in the background. And I've just set the luminous shading layer to screen, and now I can control the intensity of the caustics independently. So in this tutorial we explored how you could take a project from start to completion in Modo 601 and gave you a flavour for the options available to you, as well as many of the new features in this latest release. But I think the most important thing about this experience is how the toolset and UI allow for an almost seamless progression through the project, allowing you to jump from one task to another with ease. At the end of the day, I think this is what always has been and always will be Modo's most important feature.